I am a philosopher. He concealed that fairly well, I thought, too, from you in the introduction. Boswell, in his Life of Johnson, tells of a friend of Johnson who had thought of going into philosophy, but somehow cheerfulness kept breaking through. You'll understand that remark better as the afternoon progresses. This is, I think, Christi Fidelis, one of the items of good news in the Church today. Catholic Dossier, the next issue of that journal, is going to be devoted to the good news. Most of the time we are dealing with various outrages in the Church and expressing our dismay and indignation and the like. And I thought it'd be a change of pace. We'll probably lose a lot of subscribers, but it'd be a change of pace to draw attention to all the wonderful things that are going on. And I think you may enjoy that, but certainly Christi Fidelis will be one of the things to which we'll be drawing attention. I'm to talk about Thomas Aquinas, known as the Dumb Ox. The title is about Thomas, not myself, that you might have seen on the poster. It's very easy, it's very delightful for me to talk about a man whom I've studied now for many decades, and about whom I've written a bit. I've tried to understand and help other people understand his thought over a very long, prolonged academic career. And I'm more convinced now than ever I was of his perennial importance. This is, of course, the mind of the Church. Thomas has been put before us as our principal guide and mentor, both in philosophy and in theology. There are those who have thought, and some have said, that Vatican II dismantled Thomism and in effect removed Thomas from that privileged place that he had held in the Church prior to the Council, as again our principal guide and mentor, both in philosophy and in theology. Well, like many things that were said about the Council, that's not true. Thomas is recommended in 2 of the 16 documents of Vatican II. It's the first time anyone has ever been recommended in any ecumenical council, Thomas or anyone else. So this hardly looks like a demotion to me. But it is a sad fact that many of the myths about Vatican II, which have had such a devastating effect on so many of our institutions, brought about, in effect, the dismantling of Thomism in our Catholic colleges and universities. Those of an age will remember that when you enrolled at a Catholic university or college, there was a set number of philosophy courses that you were going to take, whether or not you were going to major in philosophy. And so too with theology. And the idea was that a Catholic education, acquiring the mind of the Church, participating in the great patrimony of Catholicism, entailed, among other things, a good grounding in philosophy and in theology. When I first came to Notre Dame 42 years ago, 4 courses were required of undergraduates. And this was, of course, a very small number when you compared it with Jesuit colleges and universities. I had taught for a year at Creighton University in Omaha, a Jesuit university, and far more courses were required in philosophy of every student, no matter what his major or future aspirations might be. We had 4. We are now down to 2 required courses in philosophy and 2 in theology. I would be in favor of putting us both on the free market and seeing if we could survive in that particular way, because what we are doing now in those 2 fields, however interesting it might be, at least in the case of philosophy, intrinsically, it no longer fulfills that expectation that I mentioned a moment ago, namely that this sort of background would enable you to take on the mind of the Church. You can get extremely good philosophy courses at Notre Dame, but very often they will be indistinguishable from those that you might get in a secular, good secular university. So we're no longer fulfilling that purpose. So de facto, one can say, the post-conciliar picture, as far as Thomism goes, is considerably different from what it was before. And I'm saying that that's a mistake. We had to wait. The council, as you know, ended in 1965. We had to wait 20 years until the Second Extraordinary Synod before there was an official recognition of the fact that the council had been effectively hijacked, misinterpreted, misdescribed throughout the world. This was the year of the appearance of the famous first interview with Cardinal Ratzinger by the Italian journalist Missori, which spoke the truth about a lot of matters that had been more or less diplomatically overlooked at that point. Within a few months, the Second Extraordinary Synod met, and the fathers of that council distinguished officially between a good and a bad spirit of the council and enumerated the distortions of the council that had become widespread. So I bring you this bad news not as a personal opinion, but as something which the Church herself now has recognized. But of course, as we all know, the dismantling of something is ever so much easier than its restoration. And there's a sense in which restoration never really works. What you need is a renaissance. What you need is a new birth of things. And I'm going to argue and hope that we're going to see something like that in the case of Thomas. The modern interest in Thomas Aquinas in the Church dates from the issuance by Leo XIII of his encyclical Aeterni Patris in August of 1879. Leo XIII, elected Pope just a year before, was very anxious to put before the Church Thomas as a means of a restoration of the Catholic intellectual life, of Catholic philosophy and Catholic theology. And I think it's very important for us to understand what the Pope had in mind in 1879. He was not choosing a mascot. He was not saying we ought to select from this vast array of philosophers a favorite and get behind him and back his stuff and make his stock rise and so forth, as if it were arbitrary. Among the things that Leo says about Thomas in that encyclical is that in Thomas Aquinas, we are not selecting one thinker from among others. We are getting the summation of everything that had been accomplished prior to Thomas. So that he presents Thomas to us as a kind of personal summa or summation of Catholic wisdom up to the 13th century at the time of Thomas. But, and I will be returning to this, Leo is speaking in 1879, and he is, in fact, looking around the world, this pale little figure in a postage stamp republic. He is the first prisoner of the Vatican, having been elected Pope. And he is looking out at a Europe and a West which could pardonably think that it was doing pretty well. And this frail figure is saying, almost like the man in the cartoon, the little bearded fellow, go back, or repent. You're on the wrong path. Modernity is a mistake in radical ways. Now, as we can see now, he was ahead of the curve by about 100 years. Now everybody is a postmodernist. Now everybody has his critique of modernity. But Leo got there first. And he saw it not through the lens of a particular of an alternative ideology or another political theory or what have you. He saw it through the eyes of faith. And what he saw were assumptions of modernity which put civilization on a collision course with disaster. And looking at it in that way, and looking very critically at modern society when this was very unfashionable to do, both within and outside the Church, Many people were already embarrassed by this apparently backward-looking critique of modernity. But what Leo was putting forward against the background of this negative estimate of the modern world was Thomas Aquinas as the way out of the woods. Now, I think we're permitted to be a little surprised by that. We normally don't think that great cultural ills will be sort of proximately addressed by reading something, let alone reading the works of someone who has been dead for, at that time, say, 600 years, and who lived in a very different time from our own. And Leo, as I say, is addressing both practical and theoretical problems. And we might ask ourselves, what could a fat 13th century friar tell us about what's wrong with the late 19th century or a fortiori with the 20th century? But there's Leo saying, Thomas is the way. And what he has in mind is this, not simply Thomas as an individual. The reason I mentioned his statement that Thomas is not just one Christian thinker among many, but the summation of all previous thinking, is that when the Pope turns us to Christian philosophy, to Christian wisdom, and points particularly to Thomas, he is mentioning as well all of these other great figures of Christian wisdom as well. As a matter of fact, he's about a third of the way into the encyclical before he mentions Thomas Aquinas at all. I don't mean to minimize the role of Thomas, but I think we have to see the way in which Leo XIII saw him. He is seeing him as the paladin of a way of doing things, a way of using our mind, both with respect to natural knowledge and with respect to our reflections on the faith, which is the model for Christian believers. Just a word, though, about Thomas's life. He was, after all, an individual, and an individual of a remarkable kind. He lived from 1225 to 1274. He was born in a little town called Rocca Secca, Dry Rock, which is south of Rome and about 20 kilometers from Monte Cassino. When he was 5 years old, his parents brought him as an offering, as an oblate, to the Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino, and he received his first education there in the monastic school. The monastic schools, as you know, were the great repositories of a liberal education from the Dark Ages with Boethius and Cassiodorus Senator down into the 12th and 13th century. So monastic schools had a very definite kind of curriculum: secular learning, which was the liberal arts, and sacred learning, which was Scripture. Thomas was schooled in that Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino, and throughout his life had a very special devotion to the Benedictine order. The order, the rule of the order of preachers, the Dominicans, is a variation on the Dominican, or on the Benedictine rule, excuse me. When Thomas left Monte Cassino, he left because a war was raging around the place, and it became unsafe. That's happened since. As you know now, Monte Cassino is sort of Disney World. It was completely leveled in the Second World War. We did it for arguably good reason. And then it was rebuilt after the war, an exact replica of what it had been before. So when you're there, you have this weird sense of being in an old place and a brand new place all at once. Thomas left there, as I say, because it was unsafe, and he was sent down to Naples, where there was a university that had been founded by Frederick II, the so-called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. And this was a great place for Thomas to begin his university education, because it was a place where Greek and Arabic and Latin streams were beginning to come together in a way that would be definitive of the 13th century. He also had the inestimable advantage of taking logic from an Irishman at Naples, and much more importantly, he met his first Dominicans. The Dominican order was still relatively young. It was not a very prestigious sort of thing to belong to. And when he told his parents that that's what he had done, he was about 18 or 19, they were appalled. And his brothers were appalled. His relatives were appalled. Everybody was appalled. And they put him, they sequestered him in one of the family castles for a year so that he could consider what he was doing. And after that period, he was as determined in his vocation as before, and he then went north with his Dominican brethren, first perhaps to Cologne, where he studied under Albert the Great. Albert the Great was the one who, when Thomas was very stolid and taciturn in class, he wouldn't have made it in a modern seminar. He was very slow to speak. And because of that reason, he acquired the nickname of the dumb ox. And the story is that Albert said, "This dumb ox is one whose bellowing will be heard throughout Europe." That's the origin of that particular phrase. After study with Albert, Thomas went to Paris, completed his theological studies. He was a member of the faculty of Master of Theology there for 3 years. He returned to Italy for a 10-year period when he taught at Orvieto, Viterbo, in Rome. Then he returned to Paris for another stint, 3-year stint, as a professor of theology. He returned to Italy, to Naples, and just a year before his death, he had a mystical experience that prompted him to stop writing. And this left, among other things, the great Summa Theologiae unfinished. It's one of those fabulous works of our culture, which is, as it happens, unfinished. He just couldn't bring himself to go on, because he said, after what he had been shown, everything that he had written seemed to him as straw. And Joseph Pieper, who is one of the most insightful writers about Thomas Aquinas, he's still alive. He was born in 1900. Thomism is good for you, you see. He's still alive, but he has a book, The Silence of St. Thomas, in which he discusses that decision on Thomas's part to stop writing. Thomas died in 1274. He was 49 years old. The writings of his that have come down to us are ones produced by his vocation as a master of theology. This was a man whose life, as you can see, was relatively uneventful, although he was connected by blood and by various other ways with very important people, with King St. Louis of France, for example, with Frederick II, and his successors. His brothers were knights and very bellicose people. He knew a lot of important people, but his own life was a very simple one. It was the life of a friar. It was the life of a professor. And out of this grew this tremendous amount of theological and philosophical literature that Leo XIII was calling our attention to in 1879. Many of those writings have been re-edited under the aegis of Leo XIII. The great critical edition of the writings of Thomas Aquinas is called the Leonine edition. It's not MGM, it's Leo XIII. That's under his patronage that this particular edition has been or is being prepared. The three most important aspects of Thomas's life are, first of all, the fact that he was a Dominican, the fact that he was a member of a mendicant order. This meant that he was in a community that was a reforming order. It was meant to be a reform of the religious life. It was also an order that saw itself as having an intellectual mission against the various heresies. And for this reason, St. Dominic had his young men come to Paris and prepare themselves for this job of preaching the faith, defending it against heresy, and the like. This is why we have such a long tradition in the Dominican order of theologians and philosophers. Universities. The charter for the University of Paris, or the first documents that indicate that it's being recognized, date from 1200, 1213, and so forth, in through the very early years of the 13th century. And what happened, of course, was that we had a consolidation in Paris of the various monastic schools, that of Saint-Geneviève, where Peter Abelard had taught, St. Victor, where Hugh of St. Victor and Richard of St. Victor and all the other St. Victors taught, and the Cathedral School of Notre Dame. And these were amalgamated into a legal entity, a corporation, which was the University of the Faculty and Students of Paris. That was the title under which it was recognized, and this gave it certain kind of legal status as against the civil government, so that those who studied the Roman male would have clerical status and were subject to canonical law rather than to civil law. All of this came about as a result of a brawl in a bar. Nothing has changed as far as universities go, and it looked as if it was necessary to have this kind of legal separation. It also had intellectual consequences of a rather noteworthy kind. So mendicant orders, the rise of the universities. Thomas is a university person in the first century of universities in anything like our sense of the term, and Aristotle. One of the oddities of the transmission of learning is that it's not sequential. That is, you can have whole gaps where the past is unknown, and people ourselves, for example, we can know much more about Plato and Aristotle than people could have known about them 600 years ago, even though they were chronologically closer to Plato and Aristotle. At Thomas's time, an Aristotle who had been unknown in the West. Aristotle, of course, wrote in Greek, and one of the casualties of the Dark Ages was knowledge of Greek. It had to be brought in by the Irish monks and also English monks, Alcuin of York and John Scotus Erigena. But it died out, so scholars were unable to read things that weren't available to them in Latin. And early on, at the dawn of the Dark Ages, or the twilight of what preceded, Boethius had translated some of Aristotle, but basically Aristotle was an unknown. They knew his name and they knew some of the titles of his writings, but they didn't have them in their libraries. They couldn't consult them. What happens with the coming together of Islam and Judaism and Christianity, notably in the Iberian Peninsula in such places as Toledo, is that a whole library of knowledge is suddenly made available in Latin. Among these, and principally, all of the writings of Aristotle. A veritable library. Now, there had been, through the centuries of medieval education, up through the 12th century, a kind of modus vivendi that had been established between secular learning and sacred learning, when secular learning had thought to have been adequately summed up by the liberal arts, the 7 liberal arts. But with the arrival of all of this new literature, it's very clear that the liberal arts cannot contain all of these different sciences and disciplines. So a real educational crisis ensued, relatively minor, but the real crisis was, how does this comport with the Christian faith? What is a Christian believer to make of such a work as the Metaphysics of Aristotle, in which he argues on behalf of the existence of a prime mover as the cause of everything in the cause? Is that God? Is that a proof that works? How does what he says about God? God is thought thinking itself, is one of Aristotle's famous definitions of God. How does that comport with our belief? This is all suddenly an open question. And the great drama of the 13th century is the various kinds of reaction on the part of people to that problem. When G.K. Chesterton wrote his little book called The Dhamma, he unerringly went to the heart of Thomas's achievement. And if you read Maisie Ward's Life of Chesterton, something I urge you to do, I first read it in 1943. It's still available. When Maisie Ward tells us about how Chesterton wrote that book on Thomas Aquinas, the story was something like this. He had written a book on St. Francis, and his publisher loved it, everybody loved it, and his publisher said, "Why don't you write a book on Thomas Aquinas?" And he, being Chesterton, said, "Why don't I write a book on Thomas Aquinas?" So he agreed to do it. And according to this account, he dictated about half of the book, just right off. And then he stopped and he looked at his secretary and he said, "Why don't you go into town and bring me back some books about Thomas Aquinas?" So she went off to town and she brought back a few books, and he looked at them and he flipped through them and he put them down and he dictated the rest of the book. Well, se non è vero è ben trovato. How do we know? You should never believe a writer's description of how he does anything, but something like that must have been true. But I don't know anyone who has spent any time studying Thomas, and people as great as Etienne Jusson, who've written many books on Thomas, who don't read Chesterton and realize that they could not have written as effective a book. And as I said earlier, he zeroes in on what is central to Thomas, and that is a new modus vivendi established between faith and reason, between what has been revealed to us in Scripture and passed on to us by the teaching church on the one hand, and on the other, this vast amount of new learning, principally Aristotle, that had flooded in to the university system of the West. And he manages to strike a balance which is as good today, Leo XIII and later G.K. Chesterton saying, is as good today as it was then. And the sort of policy statement with which the solution begins is, it is impossible for there to be any conflict between faith and reason. The confidence of the believer is that God would not reveal to us anything that would be in conflict with what we can know to be true, because then the faith would be an absurdity. Sometimes it looks that way. The mysteries of faith we cannot understand, but we can understand them sufficiently to know that they don't conflict with anything that we know. So this policy statement is governed Thomas's procedure, and it has governed the procedure of the church ever since. So that when we come up to the time of Leo XIII, what we have here is a real difficult situation where the Bishop of Rome, when he looks out at modern thought, philosophy is no longer an ally of the faith. It's no longer in principle a complement to faith, because so much of modern philosophy was devised as an alternative to the faith, as a rejection of the faith. So this calls for a very different kind of attitude. And what it calls for, Leo XIII is telling us, we have to recover the outlook of Thomas Aquinas. Now, what that meant was we have to recover a true philosophy that can be at the service of the faith and of theology, because modern philosophy does not fill that bill. Now, there are a lot of things that we could say about the conflict or the difference or the opposition between the perennial philosophy, classical philosophy on the one hand, and modern philosophy, which may yet appear in the whole history of philosophy as a minor blip. But one way in which, I think an effective way, in which we can see the difference is by considering the father of modern philosophy, René Descartes, and just seeing what he does as opposed to what Thomas does by way of beginning and describing what he's doing. Now, everybody remembers Descartes, and you remember how exhilarating it is to read the Meditations or the Discourse on Method. Descartes had graduated from a Jesuit college. He was a nice Catholic boy, and he was in the army. He was in winter quarters, and like most of us when we finished our formal education, he had that moment when he asked himself, what do I really know? What do I really know? And while he had a great deal of things rattling around in his head, he's wondering, what would I really go to the wall for? What would I say is so true that I could never give it up, that I would die for it? And Descartes, his first reaction was, I don't think I've got anything like that. I think all I've got is an education. All I've got is a degree. All I've got is the ability to carry on conversations at parties. But what do I know? So, as you remember, what Descartes decided to do was to devise a method that would enable him to process any candidate for knowledge through it, and if it managed to get through the process, then he could salute it as a genuine piece of knowledge. But nothing, it looked, was going to be able to make it through that, because the test was, is there anything which I hold which is such that it could not conceivably be false? And under that demand, Descartes very early said, I can't take anything, any judgment that I make on the basis of sense experience and say that it's knowledge in this sense, because my senses sometimes deceive me. Sometimes I think things are larger than they are, or of different color than they really are, and so forth. So if my senses sometimes deceive me, it might be now. So I don't want to put all my chips on any judgment that is based upon sense experience. What else? Mathematics? He tries that, and for reasons that I won't go through, he convinces himself, and Descartes, you remember, was one of the great figures in the history of mathematics, that mathematics is not true knowledge right off the bat. It could not. You can't just take 2 and 2 is 4 and say, well, I know that for sure. I'd never give that up. Descartes will try to persuade you that you would. So he ends up at a given point. It's a great drama. He ends up at a given point with nothing that he has in his mind is such that he could say he knows it, that he holds it for certain. And this is the dark moment of the drama. And it's at this point that Descartes comes up with a solution that you will all remember. And that is this, that even though I may be deceived about every judgment that I consider, I can't be deceived about this, that I'm thinking. In order to be deceived, I have to be thinking, so deception doesn't work against the conviction that I have that I am a thinking something. Cogito ergo sum. You remember that? Okay. That's Descartes. This is modernity. This is the way it begins. Now, what's wrong with that? It's exciting. It's a good read. Students will, no doubt, be exhilarated by it as long as students read Descartes. What's wrong with it? The assumption of modernity is that we don't know anything until we've done philosophy. That's what Descartes is telling us, in effect. He didn't know anything before he hit upon this method and applied it. That means your Uncle George doesn't know anything either. He didn't even go to the University of Michigan, for heaven's sake. So here you've got people who, most people, and you're just going to say, on this assumption, they don't know anything until they have taken what? Philosophy 101 or Cartesianism 202 or something, and then they will be able to say, for the first, remember that ad a few years ago for some soap? For the first time in your life, feel really clean? Huh? Very insulting. So too with Descartes. Huh? For the first time in your life, really know something. Huh? So what he's saying, in effect, is this. The vast mass of mankind live in a state of darkness and confusion, and they know nothing for sure. Okay? What's the difference, or what's the alternative? The assumption of classical philosophy is a very democratic one, by contrast. And it is that everybody already knows things for certain about the world and about themselves. Huh? And that these are the beginnings, the starting points, the principles of philosophy. So that when someone engages in a philosophical argumentation, he has to begin with where everybody already is. And he has to show that whatever he proposes, however sophisticated it may eventually become, that it can be driven back to what everybody already knows. And if he can't do that, he loses, not everybody else. This is Thomas Aquinas' assumption. This is the assumption of classical philosophy. These are the assumptions that Leo XIII was interested in our getting back to philosophically. Why is it important to him as the Bishop of Rome? Because it's only people who can know things about the world for sure and about themselves who are able to hear the Word of God. When you think of the way in which Jesus taught, by way of parables, you can see that if his listeners did not already know things about the world, they would not have anything to hook on the more that he was telling them. And Christ, as a divine teacher, always begins with where we are, with what is already obvious to us, not as mistaken or deception, but what we already know. And then he leads us on from that to a realization that we could only have with his help and with his grace. But he hooks it on to the natural world, to what is naturally known. This is why the Church has always seen herself, and increasingly as the modern period goes on, as the custodian of reason as well as of faith. And it sometimes seems to one, as he looks around the academic world today, that about the only defender of reason, let alone the faith, is the Roman Catholic Church. Because if we ask ourselves who rises in the defense and clarification of the fundamental principles of human conduct that have been recognized throughout the centuries by believers and unbelievers alike, it is John Paul II. And if we ask ourselves, who is it that implicitly and explicitly assumes that human beings already know things and are capable of true knowledge about the world, it is again John Paul II. And almost nobody else. Almost nobody else. Now, since that is the case, things are a lot worse than they were in 1879. And one can argue that we are perhaps more in need of Thomas Aquinas, the thought that he represents, than Leo XIII thought the world was at the end of the 19th century. Thomas is that. He's a great thinker. You cannot read a page of Thomas without being struck by the lucidity and simplicity of his mind. There isn't a convoluted thought in Thomas Aquinas. Subject matter is often difficult, but his style is limpid and simple and boring if you just thought about it. But you're not thinking about the style. It's an instrument, something just translucent that leads you on to better and better knowledge of what he's talking of. He was also a great saint, a great mystic. And that episode that I mentioned at the end of his life, when he was prompted not to go on writing, is a clear indication of that. And one of the things, I want to close with this, I want to draw your attention to what is for me one of the most edifying facts about converts to the faith, or people who come back to the faith after wandering in the jungles of modernity for a while, or other jungles, and have an appreciation for it that they would not otherwise have, and which most of the cradle Catholics, like most of us, I suppose, we've become so familiar with the faith that we take it very much for granted. And we can learn an awful lot by watching how someone like Jacques Maritain, for example, when he and his wife came into the church, they were students at the Sorbonne. The whole atmosphere of the intellectual life was depressing. I mean, it was a mechanistic world. It was a world of necessity. Human freedom had no role to play in it. There was no destiny. There was nothing. And they suicide if they didn't find a way of going on. And they were converted. They found the faith, and they found Thomas Aquinas. Edith Stein, who studied with Edmund Husserl, the father of phenomenology, and who had lost her faith, her Jewish faith, read the life of Teresa of Avila and immediately said, this is the truth, became a Catholic, and then, although a formed philosopher, put herself, as she said, as a little schoolgirl to the study of Thomas Aquinas. And she said, the thing that I learned from Thomas Aquinas is that the life of prayer and the life of study are two sides of the same coin. And that's why we have in Thomas Aquinas a special blessing. It's not everyone who can pray to the philosopher that they're studying. But
someone asked, I have read that St. Thomas was devoted to the writings of John Cassian, conferences and institutes, and kept them on his desk. Does he quote Cassian in any of his works?
Yes, he does. And, of course, the Benedictine monastic connection would suggest... Can you hear me? Oh, too bad. The Benedictine connection would suggest his interest in John Cassian. Maritain, who was a great Thomist, was particularly devoted to the writings of Cassian as well.
What is the meaning of Neo-Thomism, and what influence does it have on Catholic philosophy today? Neo-Thomism.
Yeah, I thought you said Nero. Yeah, well, it's had a great influence on people like myself who were brought up under it, but as I indicated, it has fallen on bad days. However, I think it's fair to say that here, as in so many other areas of the church, we're coming out of it. And we're coming out of it in what seems to me now more and more to be a typical way. It's not going to be a top-down sort of thing, but there are individuals or little groups who become interested in Thomas, in this case, and begin to coalesce. And eventually, I think this may be a more effective and influential role of Thomas even than the institutionalized curricular influence of Thomas. But those of us who were the beneficiaries of those required courses and of those much maligned manuals and so forth know that they did a tremendous amount of good for Catholics who went on into fields other than philosophy. Very often those manuals are looked upon as if they were meant to be the last word in philosophy. They were the first word, but they furnished the minds and imaginations of generations of young people to the betterment, I think, of them and the church of their day.
The language of documents of Vatican II seem devoid of scholastic language. Where does St. Thomas fit it? Or fit in?
Well, they're all in Latin. I don't know what scholastic language there would mean. I mean, scholastics wrote in all kinds of different styles. So you can find, I noticed in the missal used today for the Mass, at the end there are two prayers of thanksgiving after communion, one of St. Bonaventure and one of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, these were exact contemporaries. They both died in 1274, and yet I defy you to read the two men and to think that they're really writing in the same style and in the same mode, scholastic mode. As I mentioned, two of the documents of Vatican II, the one on education in general and the one on the education of priests, specifically repeats the Church's view that Thomas Aquinas should be our principal guide in philosophy and in theology, and every pope since the council, except John Paul I, has reiterated that advice, and not just once, but again and again and again. So that if we have the ears to hear, there's certainly a message there to be heard, and a lot of people, as I say, are hearing it.
the often asked question, what is phenomenology? How does it compare to St. Thomas Aquinas' philosophy?
Well, it's relatively new as a style of philosophy. Edmund Husserl is the founder of phenomenology. And the quickest sketch of it, I think, possible is this. Husserl was trained as a mathematician and came into philosophy a little late. But he looked around and saw all of these competing theories, different accounts of the world and of human beings and so forth. And it occurred to him that it would be helpful if we could just get to the things that the theories are about before we start choosing theory. So he devised a method, the phenomenological method, which was intended just to let things appear, let them be. And his slogan was, zu den Sachen selbst, to the things themselves. And then once you got to the things and you accurately described them, then you could devise a theory. Now, whether that makes a lot of sense is something that you have to figure out for yourself. But I think the impulse is one, certainly, that one can understand. It had a tremendous spiritual effect, certainly on the first generation of phenomenologists, practically all of whom became Catholics or became much firmer believers than they had hitherto been. And there is some reason to think that Husserl himself came into the church at the end of his life. He had one of his former students who had become a nun, not Edith Stein, was his attendant in his last days, and there's some reason to think that he became Catholic. Edith Stein, of course, is the most notable figure, destined, I hope, to become a doctor of the church herself, soon to be canonized, I hope. This has been announced again and again, but she is one of the strongest minds of the 20th century. And she is strong because not only was she trained in phenomenology, but having been trained in it, she, as I said earlier, she became a little schoolgirl and sat down and studied Thomas Aquinas and wrote a book that was published posthumously, Finite and Eternal Being, which will be read for centuries. It'll take that long. It's a big book. The house is on fire.
Could you comment on the Thomistic teaching of the supernatural versus the natural end of man, and the implications of Henry de Lubac's seeming rejection of this teaching on the post-conciliar church?
Yeah. That's one of the vexed questions of 20th century theology. De Lubac, a Jesuit, wrote in the 40s a book called Surnaturel, the Supernatural. And he was very much influenced by Blondel and other figures who were close to but not in the modernist movement. What de Lubac thought he had hit upon, and what he thought all previous students of St. Thomas had missed, was the fact that Thomas says that we have a natural desire for the supernatural end, for the beatific vision. Well, since Thomas says this pretty clearly in Article 1 of Question 12 of the first part of the Summa, de Lubac wasn't the first one to notice it. But what he tended to do was to criticize Cardinal Cajetan, whose commentary is printed in that Leonine edition of the Summa that I mentioned. And Cardinal Cajetan, when he talks about this capacity that we have for the beatific vision, speaks of an obediential potency. And all he means by this is this. We have a capacity for the beatific vision, but we cannot activate that capacity. This is a matter of grace, it's a matter of receptivity, and it's a matter of conversion and repentance, and not simply a matter of an easy transition from a desire to the object of that desire. In a late work, Mémoires sur l'occasion de mes écrits, de Lubac, in effect, admits that he overstated the case against Cajetan and didn't at that point see any great difference between himself and Cajetan. But there are still people who don't know that and go on talking as if de Lubac's position was different from the great tradition and that the great tradition just missed the boat. That's not Lubach's final view.
Martin Luther was a nominalist and was hostile to scholasticism. How would you describe his period before Descartes?
Well, he was a product of scholasticism, of course, Luther. He was trained as a theologian in the scholastic mode. But when he hit upon the notion that faith alone is what saved us, reason became for him not an ally but a enemy. So that in order to emphasize the specific character of Christian faith, Martin Luther and most of the reformers, including John Calvin, felt that it was necessary to deny that human reason could arrive at any truth apart from the influence of grace. And this is a very different position, of course, from Thomas Aquinas, who thought that Aristotle had arrived, and other pagans had arrived at a great many truths about the world and indeed about God. So Aristotle was also one of the great enemies for Martin Luther. But as in most cases of heresy, what you have there is some truth which is distorted out of context. I mean, Luther saw the gratuity of faith, the gratuitousness of faith, the fact that we don't earn it, we don't argue ourselves to it, and so forth. And having seen that, he tended to debunk everything else, chiefly reason. And the Catholic position, as I indicated in my remarks, is of a complementarity between faith and reason, and not a opposition or war.
How would you answer the charge that, ecumenically speaking, Thomism is extremely problematic, since neither Eastern Orthodoxy nor Protestantism approach the faith in the categories employed by scholastic thought?
The reason I emphasized the character of Thomism that I did was to enable us to see that it's not a philosophy among others, it's not a theory among others, it's not a kind of ideology or a personal viewpoint. Thomism is only good if we can see that it follows from what we already know. So as between other rival views, the question is it something that you can lead people to from what they already know? And if my sketch of modernity is not sinfully inaccurate, what the modern view is, you don't already know anything, so I don't have to lead you from that to what I'm saying. You just have to learn how to talk in the way I do. So if philosophy is just going to be a matter of Esperanto or something, you just learn how to speak it and then you express the faith in it, then you're going to have all these rival ways of doing it. But if you have a philosophy which makes truth claims, and which hooks up to ordinary human experience, it's just not like those others, and it shouldn't be looked upon as just an entry in those sweepstakes.
Is it true that St. Thomas wrote the Summa for what we would consider today a high school level student? If so, please comment why it is so difficult for the average person to understand.
No, that's not true. Actually, he wrote it for people who already knew philosophy. So that meant that they would have finished the course, the university course in philosophy. The very first question of the Summa asked whether it's necessary to have sciences other than the philosophical sciences. Now, that could hardly be an issue for us if we didn't know what those philosophical sciences are. So it's something more and beyond. There's a little dispute among students of Thomas as to whether he wrote this for people in universities specifically or exclusively, or for the Dominicans who were being trained in the houses of study of their order. And he was interested in giving them a more rounded theological education for their practical work of preaching and confessing center. And Father Leonard Boyle, who is now head of the Vatican Library, has a famous little lecture in which he argues, he's a Dominican, that it was really to help other Dominicans that Thomas wrote the Summa. But as I say, that's a little dispute among students of Thomas. But it wasn't written for high school students. There weren't any high schools in those days.
But to what extent is St. Thomas currently being taught in Catholic universities today? Is it growing or declining?
Well, at Notre Dame we have 2.5 Thomas, and half of them is here, or the half is here. There still are people teaching Thomas Aquinas. And one thing about the present situation, it's a sort of laissez-faire thing. If you teach a course, Introduction to Philosophy, you can do it the way you think it ought to be done. I myself give a course, kind of overview of Thomas Aquinas, the thought of Aquinas, both sometimes thoughts of Aquinas, but usually just the thought of Aquinas, in which I try to give a survey of his philosophical thought. That's the book that Father mentioned, The First Glance at Thomas Aquinas, A Handbook for Peeping Thomists, is the book that I wrote after I taught that course for a while. And it's about as simple as you can get, I think, in presenting Thomas Aquinas. True as can be, though.
I guess besides universities, is scholastic philosophy on the cutting edge among secular philosophers?
Among well-informed secular philosophers. Actually, one of the oddities of the kind of declension of Thomas and of medieval thought in Catholic universities is that this was released into the public domain. And we've had, as you may know, over the last couple of decades, just a boom in medieval study in non-Catholic universities across the country. And also there has been an increased interest in Thomas Aquinas on the part of non-Catholic philosophers, and people just sort of wander into it and find it interesting and go on studying it, much as Jusson got interested in Thomas as a result of looking for the scholastic sources of Descartes. And this led him on into medieval philosophy and into Thomas Aquinas. There's a lot of that going on. If you look at the books published by Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, Cornell University Press, and so forth, you find a steady stream of books on Thomas Aquinas. And they're not written by Thomists in some kind of narrow sense or people in Catholic schools. Ironically, this might, since so many Catholic schools are always looking for where the mainstream is flowing, this sort of thing coming out of non-Catholic presses and universities might interest even Catholics in Thomas Aquinas. You never know.
Can one be a true Thomist and accept the work of Husserl and Schiller? Can one be a true Thomist and accept the work of Husserl and Schiller?
If I'm right about Thomas, she's not a philosopher among philosophers. Thomism is not a kind of philosophy. And that means anything that is true, beautiful, or useful can be assimilated into the philosophizing of someone who is guided by Thomas Aquinas. It's not an exclusive sort of thing. It's not a school in that narrow way. It's not trying to find a position, a foothold vis-a-vis others. The Thomist is duty-bound to be interested in everything that is going on in philosophy and to be sympathetically interested in it. He cannot rule out the possibility that truth will be found in the most surprising location. And that's why it's been a long tradition among scholastic philosophers to read and write about just about anything that's going on. This is not a characteristic of an analytic philosopher, to take the dominant Anglo-American mode of philosophizing. They're disinterested as a group in history as such, contemporary history as well as past history. So this is a characteristic of a philosophy that doesn't consider itself simply to be the expression of the quirks of one man or of one mind, but an effort to find out what's true about the world and ourselves and God. And anything that can help us to knowledge of those things is again to be welcome. Schiller, Husserl, Nietzsche, if that should turn out to be the case. Might be negatively the case, but reading Nietzsche can be philosophically important.
This questioner asks, why do you say that the Pope is not a phenomenologist? if in fact you say that.
Well, it's in a way that's a small question. Is the Pope interested in phenomenology? He wrote his dissertation on Shaler, who was a phenomenologist, a Catholic. He also wrote a dissertation on John of the Cross. So do I want to say he's a Carmelite mystic on the basis of that dissertation? The reason I hesitate is that there have been those who have a kind of a stock broker's interest in phenomenology who wanted to claim the Pope for phenomenology. And there was the acting person, for example. The English version that we have of it is very unreliable. And it's actually the German version of that work that the Pope prefers to have be the point of reference for what he says and what he doesn't say in it. The tendency on the part of translators into English has been to obscure and actually to omit references to Thomas Aquinas and to emphasize the references to Husserl. And so you can see it's a bit of a silly academic game. Whatever is good in Husserl, the Pope and any Thomist would welcome, and so too with respect to Thomas Aquinas. But it's not a matter of sticking with your mascot. It's not a matter of sticking with the side or anything like that. Thomas doesn't claim our allegiance in that way. If one, after many years, feels greatly indebted to Thomas, it's because he has helped one, the hope is, to come to knowledge of some truths about the world, not about Thomas Aquinas' psyche.
The level of Catholic instruction at churches in New Jersey seems particularly awful. Any suggestions how a layperson can help change that?
Well, you get some relics of St. Thomas Aquinas and bring them to New Jersey. Why pick on New Jersey? It's awful everywhere, for instance. What we should, I think, conclude from that is not that a lot of dreadful people have been doing dreadful things, but to see it as a claim on our own zeal and what we might do, the little things that we might do, or the big thing. And when I look at groups like this, see the auspices under which I was brought here, I'm very much encouraged that here and all around the country, there are people who don't just say things are bad in New Jersey, but they do something about it in their own state, in their own city, and so forth. And I think that's probably healthier than reciting the faults of other people and ourselves in other incarnations, maybe. There's some small satisfaction to be derived from that, but it's not good for the character.
What disagreements, either philosophical or theological, do you have with St. Thomas?
What?
Disagreements.
Oh, disagreements.
Yeah.
Well, I'd have to think about that. I don't think that the Earth is the center of the cosmos, for one thing. I guess I would differ from him on that. There's some reason to think from some of his writings that he held to delayed harmonization. I don't agree with that. But on the big things, I tend to be with him. 2 and 2 is 4 and things like that. I think he got it right. I guess I tend, after all these years, and it's been nearly 50 that I've been studying Thomas Aquinas, I'm much more conscious of the truths that I've learned from him than from the things that I kind of skip over pretty fast when I come upon them again, such as the 2 I mentioned.
Who is smarter, Father Dowling or Father Brown?
Father Dowling says Father Brown is smarter, and he ought to know. Father Dowling's relative is here with us today. He's here in disguise, so you won't recognize him, but he's here.
And lastly, does the liberal establishment at Notre Dame pose a threat to you in any way?
What liberal establishment? What is this? No.